On the afternoon of Sunday, April 23, 2017, 20-year-old Haley Rathgaber walked across the busy dining room of the Texas Roadhouse restaurant in Evansville, Indiana, carrying 2 plates of hot food from the kitchen. Haley stopped at a table near a window and set the plates down in front of a pair of customers. Then she gave a big smile and told them to enjoy the meal. But as Haley walked back towards the kitchen, she happened to glance up at the clock on the wall, and when she saw the time, her smile totally disappeared and she felt this jolt of anxiety. Haley knew in a little under an hour, her shift would be over, and she would no longer have work to take her mind off this insane secret that she was keeping from almost everybody she knew. Earlier that month, one of Haley's best friends, a young woman named Jordan Hughes, had lost her 10-month-old baby in a devastating accident. Jordan's boyfriend, who was not the baby's father but was helping take care of him, had been home alone with the baby. He'd strapped the baby into a car seat and started walking down the stairs in the house when he suddenly tripped over a diaper bag, and he and the baby both went tumbling down the steps, which ultimately resulted in the child's death. Or at least, that's what he had told his girlfriend Jordan and the police. Jordan had gotten the news quickly about her child and rushed to the hospital, hoping her baby would survive. And she told Haley everything that had happened and asked Haley to go to her house to pick up some things for her and bring them back to the hospital. But when Haley got to Jordan's house, she quickly realized that the story Jordan's boyfriend had told them didn't make any sense. The diaper bag that the boyfriend had supposedly tripped over was neatly placed on the couch, and it looked like it had never even been used, let alone tripped over in this dramatic fashion that the boyfriend had described. Haley had also noticed there was no scuff marks on the stairs or the nearby wall. Nothing anywhere inside the house appeared to be damaged or in disorder, and practically everything she saw seemed to contradict the boyfriend's story. And so by the time Haley had left Jordan's house, she was convinced that Jordan's boyfriend, a guy named Thaddeus Rice, was lying. And when the baby had eventually died at the hospital, Haley felt almost positive that Thaddeus had something to do with the baby's death. Back in the busy restaurant, Haley grabbed more food from the kitchen and delivered it to one of her tables. For some reason, whenever she was helping customers or talking to her close friends she worked with, a small group that called themselves the Roadies, she could totally block out everything she'd seen in Jordan's house. The second she closed out her final table, Haley felt like she might have a panic attack right there in the middle of the restaurant. Haley took a seat at the restaurant bar and tried to catch her breath. She removed her work apron and then reached inside the front pouch of the apron and pulled out a thick wad of cash, her tip money for the night. She slipped the cash into her jeans pocket and just kept taking deep breaths, trying as hard as she could to calm herself down. Haley suddenly felt a hand on her back, and she turned and saw her friend and coworker, Ainsley Bowles, take the seat next to her. Haley had only shared the secret with 2 people, her mother and Ainsley. And while Haley's mother had told her to go talk to the police immediately about Thaddeus, Ainsley understood why Haley still had not done that. Because Ainsley and Haley were both afraid of Thaddeus. He was their friend's boyfriend, so they'd always tried to get along with him, but they knew Thaddeus had a criminal record and had been involved in at least one rape case. Ainsley asked Haley how she was holding up, but before Haley could answer, another member of the roadie crew, Jake Allen, walked up to the bar and announced that he was hosting a small hangout after he got off work, and if anybody wanted to come over and have drinks, they were welcome. He said so far, their friend and fellow roadie, Isaiah, would be there, but he was hoping more people would come. Haley thought about it for a second. Now, she loved hanging out with Jake and Isaiah and the rest of the roadie's crew, and specifically with Jake and Isaiah, she would typically confide in both of them about everything, like she did with Ainsley. But right now, she just didn't want to tell these guys what was going on with her, because Jake and Isaiah could be very protective of Haley and Ainsley, and she didn't want them doing anything stupid or drastic once they learned about her theory around Thaddeus and the baby. Also, Haley and Ainsley had a big exam in one of their college classes the following morning. And so ultimately, Haley and Ainsley thanked Jake for the offer, but said they would both have to pass this time. Jake said he totally understood, but if either of them changed their minds, they knew how to reach him. Jake returned to work, and Haley and Ainsley stayed at the bar. And at some point, in a voice barely above a whisper, Ainsley asked Haley if she was going to finally tell Thaddeus' girlfriend, or the cops, about her suspicions. Haley looked down and said she still had no clue. Every time she thought about it, she got so scared about what Thaddeus might do to her. Later that evening, Haley was at her apartment alone, studying for her big exam and still trying to keep her mind off of everything else, when she heard her phone vibrate on the table. She put down her notes, looked at her phone, and saw a text message. After reading it, Haley thought about it for a second. She knew she really should keep on studying, but this diversion might help her relax for a bit. So she picked up her phone and replied to the message, and then afterward, she headed to the bathroom to put on some makeup and also change out of her t-shirt and sweats and put on a pair of jeans, a long-sleeve shirt, and a jacket. She was ready to go out. The next morning, so April 24th, a woman was driving her daughter to school along the route she always took. She knew this route so well, in fact, that sometimes she found herself zoning out completely while driving it, almost like she was on autopilot. But on this morning, as she approached the soccer field that stood out from the endless grassy overgrowth that surrounded the area, something caught this woman's attention. At first, she couldn't make out what she was seeing. All she could tell was that there was something strange in the soccer field's gravel parking lot. And then, as she continued down the road and got a little bit closer and realized what she was seeing, the woman slammed on the brakes and told her daughter to wait in the car. The woman got out of her car and ran over to the soccer parking lot, hoping maybe her eyes had just played a trick on her and she hadn't really seen what she thought she saw. But when she got closer, she knew she had been right. She grabbed her phone and called 911. About 15 minutes later, so just after 7 a.m., Warwick County Sheriff's investigator, Paul Cruz, pulled up to the soccer field, got out of his unmarked police car, and made his way past the yellow crime scene tape. Cruz greeted the deputies and members of the forensics team who had arrived shortly before him. Then he walked past them and continued a bit further across the lot, and there he saw a young woman lying dead in the gravel. Cruz knelt down next to her and saw a wound in the back of her head, which clearly looked like it came from a gunshot, and he also saw a blue towel that was covered in blood lying next to her. Cruz scanned the ground near the body, and he didn't see any drag marks or anything to indicate that this young woman had been taken to this location by force. He and the forensics team would obviously need to do a lot more work, but for now, Cruz figured the most logical explanation was that this young woman had been walking through the lot when someone approached her from behind and shot her. Cruz looked around the lot and got an eerie feeling. He didn't see a single streetlight or lamppost anywhere in sight. This area was totally desolate, so if this young woman had been killed last night or early in the morning, it would have been pitch black here. Cruz had no idea why this young woman was walking through this dark parking lot, but he did know it would have been really easy for someone to follow her without ever being seen. Cruz crouched down over the body again, and he noticed an area of bare gravel on both sides of one of the dead woman's legs. It almost looked like she had made a partial snow angel in the gravel with that leg, and this really upset Cruz, because it likely meant that this young woman had not died immediately after being shot. She had fallen to the ground and squirmed before dying. Cruz stood back up and stepped away from the body, and then asked a crime scene investigator if he or anyone else had found a wallet or any kind of ID at the scene. But the crime scene investigator just shook his head. The dead woman had nothing on her. No wallet, no cell phone, no keys, nothing. They had no idea who this victim was. Later that morning, about 15 miles away from that soccer field, Haley's mother, Heather Collins, poured herself a mug of coffee, sat down on her front porch, and opened up her laptop. Heather began by scrolling through Facebook, which she did every morning. But, as she read through the posts in her feed, she began seeing something that disturbed her. All her friends from town were posting the same story from the local news. It was about this unidentified young woman who was found dead that morning outside of town. Heather's kids were 3 young women, all close in age, and so Heather immediately felt the maternal instinct to check on them and make sure each of them was okay. And so she promptly sent text messages to her 2 youngest daughters, and then also to Haley, her oldest daughter. And within minutes, her phone lit up, and Heather was relieved to see responses from her 2 younger girls. But she didn't get a response from Haley. However, she wasn't surprised, because she knew Haley had an important exam that morning, and Haley usually prioritized school over anything else. But an hour went by, and Heather still had not heard from Haley, so she called Haley's phone. The call went straight to voicemail. Heather left her daughter a message, trying to disguise how worried she was starting to feel, The next 30 minutes slowed to a crawl as Haley still didn't get in touch with her mother. And so finally, Heather picked up her phone again and she called Haley's friend, Ainsley, who went to the same college as Haley. Ainsley answered, and before Heather could even explain why she was calling, Ainsley asked her what was going on. She said Haley had not shown up to class that morning and missed the big exam. When Haley's mother heard this, she immediately felt sick to her stomach and had this horrible sense of dread come over her. Heather hung up and began talking aloud, trying to soothe herself. This was not her child out by the soccer field. It couldn't be her. It can't be her. Heather kept repeating this over and over again like a mantra, trying to convince herself that Haley was really safe, but it didn't work. So, after desperately waiting to hear back from Haley for a bit longer and still not hearing from her, Heather grabbed her phone once more and called a friend of hers who happened to be a detective for the Evansville Police Department. And when the detective answered, Heather told him that she had heard the news about the unidentified body and she couldn't get in touch with her daughter Haley, and she was now really worried. Heather's detective friend told her that given where the body was found, that this case was actually out of his jurisdiction. However, he did have some contacts at the Warwick County Sheriff's Office, and he said he would call them to see what he could find out. Heather provided her detective friend a physical description of Haley. She had long light brown hair with blonde highlights, and her teeth were always really bright white. Heather also told the detective the type of clothing Haley typically wore, and she sent him pictures of Haley's tattoos. Then she hung up and waited. A short time later, Heather's phone rang. It was now the Warwick County Sheriff's Office calling, and when they spoke to her, they said they actually wanted to speak to her in person. Haley's mother immediately began to shake, and she felt the blood drain from her face. She could think of only one reason why they would want to talk to her face to face, and she just wanted to curl up and die. Anything but face the news she knew she was about to hear. A short time later, Heather heard a knock on her door. When she opened it up, she saw it was deputies from the Warwick County Sheriff's Office. Heather immediately began to shake all over, and she felt the blood drain from her face. And as soon as she heard one of the deputies utter the words, "I'm sorry," Heather broke down and collapsed to the floor. Her daughter Haley was dead. Later that afternoon, investigator Cruz walked away from the crime scene at the soccer field, got into his car, and began driving across town. And as he drove, he felt very frustrated. Earlier, he'd gotten a call from the station, so he now knew his victim was a college student named Haley Rathgaber. But that was about all he knew. He and his team had thoroughly combed the crime scene and the area surrounding it, but almost nothing had come from their search. Not even a single shell casing had turned up. In fact, the only evidence that had been bagged at the scene was that bloody blue towel found next to the body, which the medical examiner was sending off to the crime lab for DNA analysis. After a short drive, investigator Cruz pulled into the sheriff's station, and he walked in just as Heather, Haley's mom, was arriving. She was there to get more information about what happened to her daughter. Cruz very gently approached Heather, who was clearly still crying, and he told her how sorry he was that her daughter was gone, and he promised that he'd find out who did this and bring that person to justice. Cruz understood now was not a great time to sit down and ask Heather a bunch of questions, but he said he did need to ask her one thing. Could she think of anyone at all, who might have wanted to hurt Haley? Haley's mother didn't even hesitate. She looked right at Cruz and said she knew of one person for sure who would want to do this: Thaddeus Rice. When Cruz heard this name, he did a double take. Cruz knew this name very well, because Thaddeus Rice was a suspect in another case he was currently working on. So now Cruz really wanted to know more if Heather was comfortable still sharing. Heather said, of course, and she proceeded to tell him the whole story. And as Cruz listened to Heather, he knew exactly where the story was going, because this story was the other case he was investigating: the death of Thaddeus's girlfriend's baby boy. Heather told Cruz that Haley suspected Thaddeus might have been directly involved in the death of that baby. And so Heather said if Thaddeus knew Haley suspected him, he would have every reason to want to shut her up. Before Cruz could even respond, Heather took her phone out of her pocket and told him she needed to show him something. She unlocked her phone and quickly pulled up a message that a friend of Haley's had sent her just before Cruz had arrived at the station. It was a video that Thaddeus had recently posted to his social media. And in this video, Thaddeus is seen posing with a gun. Immediately after seeing this video, Cruz thanked Heather for the information, and he turned around, got back into his car, and drove to Thaddeus's workplace. And when he got there, Thaddeus happened to be outside on a break. However, the second Cruz stepped out of his car, Thaddeus waved him away dismissively and said he had nothing to say to him. Cruz made it clear to Thaddeus that he was not there to talk about the dead baby. Instead, he was there to talk about Haley. Thaddeus just stared back at Cruz, and Cruz honestly couldn't tell if Thaddeus was confused or scared. Finally, though, Thaddeus said he wouldn't talk to cops without an attorney, and then he turned and walked away. Cruz knew he could go after Thaddeus, but he also knew it wouldn't make a difference. Thaddeus was not about to talk to him. Thaddeus had been involved in enough criminal cases to understand his rights. But even without having a long conversation with him, Thaddeus's reaction to hearing Haley's name had just made him seem a whole lot more suspicious. Around the same time Cruz was confronting Thaddeus, a young man named Isaiah Hagen sat on his front porch staring at his phone. Isaiah was Haley's close friend and coworker, one of the members of the Roadies crew, and right now he was looking at a series of text messages from other members of that group, specifically his friends Jake and Ainsley, saying that Haley had been found dead by the soccer field just outside of town. And so Isaiah was just processing it and beginning to cry, and then right at that moment, he heard his mother inside the house behind him, and he instinctively just got up, went inside, and hugged his mom, and began crying even harder. She asked him what was wrong, and Isaiah told her about Haley, and his mom couldn't believe what she was hearing. She worked for the county sheriff, so she knew all about the young woman who'd been found at the soccer field, but she had no idea this young woman was one of her son's good friends. Isaiah hugged his mother tighter and told her that none of this made any sense, because he'd just seen Haley the night before, and everything had seemed fine. How could she be dead? Isaiah's mom pulled away from him, and she told him she understood how upset he was, but he really needed to go talk to the lead investigator right away, because even if Isaiah didn't realize it, he might have seen something or heard Haley say something last night that could help investigators find her killer. Cruz was at the station sitting at his desk looking through Thaddeus's rap sheet when his phone rang. He picked up the call, and Isaiah introduced himself and said that his mother worked at the sheriff's station. Cruz asked if everything was okay, and Isaiah said he was calling about his friend Haley, the girl who'd been found at the soccer field. He explained to Cruz that he had just seen Haley the night before, and he wanted to help if he could. Cruz told Isaiah that he could help by walking him through everything he remembered from the previous night. This would help Cruz flesh out the timeline of Haley's final hours. Isaiah told Cruz that the night before, he had been at his friend Jake Allen's place playing video games when he got a text message from Haley. And in this text, she said she was going to meet someone at a local park where the college students sometimes hang out. And she asked Isaiah if he could give her a ride because she didn't want to leave her car there. Isaiah said that was no problem, so he had left Jake's place, went to Haley's, hung out with her for a minute, and then drove her to the park. Isaiah told Cruz he had no idea who she was meeting. He said he didn't ask her about it because it felt like it was none of his business, especially if she was meeting up with some guy who she was romantically involved with. Isaiah said after he dropped Haley off, he just went back to Jake's house and kept playing video games until very early in the morning. Inspector Cruz kept listening and writing everything down, but then suddenly Isaiah just went silent, and Cruz could hear him trying to catch his breath. And when Isaiah started talking again, it was clear he was very upset. He told Cruz he felt really guilty now, and he wished he had asked Haley who she was meeting, because maybe he could have done something to protect her, or at a minimum today been able to provide the police a suspect. Cruz told Isaiah that he appreciated him calling in, and that he would follow up if he had any questions. After getting off the phone with Isaiah, Cruz quickly scanned the list of coworkers that Haley worked with at the Texas Roadhouse, and just as he remembered, there was Jake Allen's name and a phone number right next to it. And so Cruz called Jake and asked him if he could verify the times he had hung out with Isaiah the night before, and Jake corroborated Isaiah's story. But while speaking to Jake, investigator Cruz looked up Jake's address, and he saw that Jake lived very close to the park where Isaiah said he'd dropped Haley off, and that park was only a few miles from the soccer field where Haley was found dead. And so Cruz began to question Jake about his own activities the previous night, and pretty quickly, the call took a very weird turn. Now, Cruz considered all of Haley's friends and coworkers to be possible suspects, but he really thought this call might just be a chance to cross Jake off his list. But Cruz noticed that Jake suddenly started to sound very nervous and defensive as soon as his actions were called into question. Jake insisted that he hadn't seen Haley at all the previous night. In fact, he hadn't seen Haley since work that afternoon. He said he had invited her and their other friend Ainsley over to hang out, but they both had declined. And then after talking about Haley for a minute, Jake suddenly shifted gears back to Isaiah, saying he thought it was very strange how Isaiah would just drive Haley out to the park and leave her there. Cruz let Jake keep talking, but he wondered if Jake had something to hide, and if that's why he was throwing suspicion onto his friend Isaiah. After hanging up with Jake, Cruz went back to his list of everyone who had worked at the Roadhouse with Haley. Up until this call, Cruz had really only been focused on Thaddeus, who didn't work at the Roadhouse, and he definitely still considered Thaddeus a major suspect with a very clear motive. But now, Cruz felt like he really should put some additional attention on the Roadhouse employees, specifically Jake and Isaiah. On the evening of April 26th, so 2 days after Haley's body had been found, Cruz and a couple of members from his team arrived at Jake's apartment. Cruz knocked on the door, and Jake's roommate answered. Cruz introduced himself and asked to speak to Jake. The young man turned and shouted for Jake, looking a little freaked out that a bunch of cops had just shown up at his door, and then the roommate walked away. A few seconds later, Jake approached the door, wearing a dress shirt with an untied tie hanging on the collar. Cruz said he was the detective who had talked to Jake on the phone, and he needed to ask him a few more questions. Jake said he understood, but he was getting ready to leave for a candlelight vigil some friends and family were having for Haley. This made Cruz pause for a second. His investigation wasn't even 2 days old, and he'd been going pretty much non-stop since it started, and he'd almost overlooked how young Haley was, and how many people her death must have affected. Still, Cruz needed some answers. He told Jake he would do his best not to keep him too long, but he needed Jake to go through everything he had done after he'd seen Haley at work on the day she died. And just like Jake had said to Cruz on the phone, he said after work he had gone home and met up with Isaiah to play video games. It was basically the same story. However, during this in-person exchange, Jake also said something about Isaiah that really stood out to Cruz and made him look at the case very differently. Cruz took notes on everything Jake told him, asked a few follow-up questions, and then he and his team left so Jake could get ready for the vigil. That night, a huge group of Haley's friends and family gathered by the soccer field where Haley had been found. The candles they lit cast a glow over the otherwise pitch-black parking lot. They laid down flowers, shared some of their favorite memories, and just talked about how much Haley had meant to all of them. Her closest friends from work left Haley's name tag and her Roadhouse cap and sweatshirt right next to a big handmade sign that simply said, "We love and miss you. Love, your roadies." On April 27th, the day after the vigil, Inspector Cruz received word from the crime lab that the results had come in on the bloody blue towel that had been found next to Haley's body. Only one DNA profile was found on the towel, and much to Cruz's disappointment, it was Haley's. Cruz had hoped he would catch a break and that these results would lead him right to the killer. But now that he knew that was not going to happen, he methodically went through his list of Haley's friends and coworkers another time. Thaddeus, who remained one of Cruz's primary suspects, still refused to say anything without a lawyer. But almost everyone else who had known Haley was willing to help and tell Cruz whatever they could. And the more Cruz spoke to Haley's friends, the more convinced he became that he was much closer to solving this case than he had initially thought. Because a lot of Haley's friends said things that pointed him in the same direction. So Cruz came up with an idea of how he might be able to track Haley's movements before she got to the soccer field where she was ultimately found. He got in his car, headed to Haley's neighborhood, and just started knocking on the door of every house or apartment complex he saw that had a security camera or a doorbell with a video camera. He asked anyone who answered if he could have the footage from their cameras to help him solve a crime. And everyone he spoke to said he absolutely could. And so after Cruz collected all of that footage from Haley's neighborhood, he did the same exact thing in Thaddeus's girlfriend's neighborhood, which is where Thaddeus spent most of his time. Over the next couple of days, Cruz sat at the station and sifted through hours upon hours of security footage that he had collected. The experience began to remind Cruz of the old cliche about watching paint dry, and at times, Cruz felt he'd much rather be looking at a freshly painted wall than at endless grainy footage of houses and apartment buildings in suburban Indiana. Cruz kept fighting off sleep and tried to keep his eyes glued on the footage as hours passed by without anything eventful happening, until he hit pay dirt. For a second, Cruz wasn't even really sure he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. After all, watching this footage for so long had basically sent him into a daze, so he rewound the footage and watched it again, and this time he was sure he did see something that would help him close the case and bring Haley's murderer to justice. Cruz watched more footage to make sure he wasn't missing something. He also worked with his team to collect cell phone data, and he carried out a few more interviews just to be certain he was on the right track. And on April 29th, just 5 days after Haley's body was found, Inspector Cruz knew he had found Haley's killer. He arrested them, and after that, he discovered exactly what had happened to Haley on the night she died. Based on surveillance footage, interviews, and evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Haley Rathgaber on the night of April 23, 2017. Around 10:30 p.m. that night, the killer fished a 9mm handgun out of the closet and then left to go meet up with Haley. Haley got into the killer's car, and the killer began driving her to the soccer field just outside of town. When they got there, Haley and the killer stepped out of the car and began walking across the gravel parking lot near the field, with only the headlights of the killer's car and the flashlight on Haley's phone to light the way. As they walked, the killer let Haley walk ahead of them, and without Haley noticing, the killer silently drew their 9mm handgun, raised it up, aimed, and fired a single shot into the back of Haley's head. Haley stumbled, and the killer took several steps back and watched as she fell. Haley collapsed onto her back. The only part of her body that was working now was her left leg, which she jerked back and forth in the gravel as her brain slowly shut down. The killer just stood there and watched as Haley died. And in that moment, for a second, the killer felt bad about what they had just done. But regardless, after she was dead, the killer turned away from the body, went back to their car, and grabbed a blue towel they happened to have in the back seat. The killer then walked back to Haley's body, knelt down, and used the towel to wipe up some of the blood. After that, they put the towel down, and then scooped up Haley's phone off the ground. They also reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet, which contained $200 in cash. And then the killer stood up, took one more look at the body, and then turned and ran back to the car, carrying their gun and Haley's stuff with them. Later that night, the killer went to their friend's place and hung out playing video games all night, without ever showing the slightest hint of what they had just done. Haley's close friend and fellow roadie, Isaiah Hagen, was her killer. Isaiah, whose mother worked for the sheriff's department, had called Inspector Cruz and tried to make it look like he was helping the investigation. And Isaiah's call even threw some suspicion on his friend Jake for a time. However, when Cruz and his team met with Jake on the night of the candlelight vigil, Jake started talking about his friend Isaiah. He hated to admit it because the two young men had been really close for years, but Jake said Isaiah had been acting really strange lately, and this was because Isaiah had run into some serious money problems. It turned out that leading up to the murder, Isaiah had borrowed hundreds of dollars from his father and from Haley. While Haley had not confronted Isaiah about the money he owed her, Isaiah's father wanted to get paid back. So Isaiah decided to take the money he owed his dad from Haley. On the night of the murder, Isaiah was the one who texted Haley while she was studying and asked her if they could hang out, because he really wanted to talk to her. And Haley decided she needed a break from studying and from everything else that was going on in her life, so she said yes. Isaiah picked Haley up, but he never drove her to the park to meet someone else like he had told police. Instead, he drove right to the soccer field, and shortly after getting out of the car, he shot and killed her. It's not clear if Isaiah first tried to just ask Haley for the money and, maybe she refused to give him money and that's what led to the murder, or if Isaiah simply picked Haley up with every intention of murdering her for the money. Either way, it resulted in Haley's death and Isaiah stealing the $200 out of her wallet. In the morning following the murder, right before sunrise, Isaiah drove around town, getting rid of his gun and Haley's belongings, and then he went back to his house and left the $200 from her wallet on the kitchen counter for his dad. After speaking to Jake in person, Cruz really began to suspect that Isaiah was the killer. But he still could not just write off Thaddeus, a man who had a criminal history, had potentially harmed or even killed a baby, and who Haley had been afraid of before she died. So Cruz collected cell phone data for Haley and also for both Isaiah and Thaddeus, and he also studied all the surveillance footage he had collected. Isaiah and Haley's cell phone data showed that they had at least been near the same locations, including the soccer field, at the same time on the night of the murder. And the surveillance footage showed Isaiah pulling up to Haley's place not too long before she was killed. The footage also showed that Thaddeus had been at his girlfriend's house at the time of the murder and throughout the entire night. And so even though the murder weapon was not recovered, Cruz felt confident he'd cracked the case and he arrested Isaiah. Isaiah insisted he would never hurt Haley and that he was innocent, but during his trial, his mother was put on the witness stand and she testified that Isaiah had privately admitted to her that he'd been the one who shot Haley. He had told his mother it was an accident, but the evidence in the case did not support that. It took the jury only 4 hours to find Isaiah guilty. In early August of 2018, he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Thaddeus, who Haley believed had played a part in the death of his girlfriend's baby, was eventually found guilty of neglect of a dependent and reckless homicide in the death of the child. On the morning of June 25, 2007, a 28-year-old man named Mike Barnett woke up to the sound of pounding rain on the roof of his home, which was located in Hull, which is a city in northern England. Mike groaned as he rolled out of bed. It had been raining like this for the past month, and he and the rest of the people in Hull were just totally over it. But another reason he groaned is he knew that he would have to go to his job at a tropical fish store, even though he was not scheduled to work that day. There was a street right behind the tropical fish store that always completely flooded out from all these debris getting clogged in the drain, and the owner of the tropical fish store, so Mike's boss, who was an elderly guy, he would always go out and try to clear the debris himself, and Mike just knew, he really needed help, and today he knew his boss would be out there, and so he just felt like it was his responsibility to go in and help him clear out the debris. So Mike got dressed, he had some breakfast, and then as quietly as he could, he slipped out the front door. Mike was careful not to make too much noise because he didn't want to wake his dad, who he lived with. Mike and his dad had always been very close, but after the death of Mike's mother, he and his father had become even closer, and so they actually really enjoyed living together. But Mike also knew that his dad was very protective of him and very likely would not like the idea of Mike going out in this horrible storm to go try to clear debris in a flooded out street. It just was too dangerous. And Mike just didn't want to deal with that right now, and so he was able to slip out without waking up his dad. Mike hopped in his car and he drove to the fish store, and as soon as he got there, he hopped out, he went around to the back side of the shop, and sure enough, the entire street out back was totally flooded. Clearly, debris had blocked the drainage system. Now, Mike's boss was not out there yet. Mike could see him inside the shop, kind of going about his morning, and so Mike, without even going inside, just began wading into the water to begin clearing debris. The drain that was clogged by all this debris was located just off to the side of the sidewalk. It was down in a culvert. And so Mike very carefully walked off that sidewalk into this very cold, muddy water, and he began moving in the direction of where he knew the drain was. And so as he's walking, the water is down to his ankles, maybe up to his knees at some point, but he gets closer and closer to where he knows this drainage is down in this culvert. And suddenly, Mike begins feeling this unbelievable suction at his feet that began pulling him basically straight down. Mike tried to move, but his feet were anchored to the ground, and then before long, he began getting pulled forward towards this drain, and then down he went. And as he went all the way down to his neck in the water, he felt this unbelievable pain in his thigh. Mike didn't know it, but his leg had been sucked through the drainage gate that was all blocked up. There were still some holes in it, and so his leg had gone through one of those holes, and it had pulled him all the way up to the top of his thigh and brutally snapped his leg in the process. And so Mike is in blinding pain from his leg being shattered and run through this grate, and he's literally up to his neck in this frigid water, and the wind's blowing and it's raining and the water's going in his mouth. And so Mike begins to panic and he's trying to pull himself out. He can't. And then he begins screaming for help. And at that moment, the owner of the fish store, who was still inside the store, looked out the window and he saw Mike flailing around. And instinctively, the owner could tell, just from the panicked look on Mike's face, that whatever was happening to him was an emergency. And so the owner just picked up the phone, called the police, and after telling them what was happening, the owner ran out to Mike. When the first police officers arrived on the scene, Mike was still in the water up to his neck, and the shop owner was right next to him. And the police officers, they assessed the situation in front of them, and they thought, okay, clearly this guy, Mike, is trapped in the water. This is serious, but we can pull him out. That's the obvious solution here. And so the two officers walked up to Mike, they waded through the water and got on either side of him, kind of pushing the shop owner out of the way. And then the two officers grabbed Mike's shoulders. These are strong police officers, and they began pulling on Mike. And as soon as they did, Mike let out this unbelievably loud scream of just pure agony. And in fact, his scream was so guttural that the two officers let go and were kind of startled by it. And very quickly, these officers realized this situation is far worse than it appears. Because not only is this guy totally stuck and he can't be moved, but, they're looking around and the rain is still coming down and it's clear the water is still slowly rising. And because Mike's body was situated over the grate, he himself was causing even more blockage, increasing how much the street was flooding. Meaning the officers knew they had to get Mike out as soon as possible or he would drown. But over the next several hours, more police officers, firefighters, EMTs, Good Samaritans, everybody showed up on the scene, and there were so many attempts to get Mike out of the water, ranging from trying to cut the grate, but the water was too muddy so nobody could see through it, and the water was so strong that nobody could set the bolt cutters on the actual grate. And then at one point, they even tied a winch around Mike and tried to pull him out with a Land Rover, but every intervention failed. The rushing water that was pinning Mike to this grate was so strong, and Mike's pain in his leg was so high, it made it nearly impossible to move him. And so finally, at the 4-hour mark that Mike has been trapped in this water, a decision was made amongst all the first responders to amputate. So the police called a doctor who was willing to perform the leg amputation. And then after doing it, Mike could sense something was up. Clearly it's not going well. And he began frantically asking the police and all the first responders, when are you going to get me out of here? When are you going to get me out of here? And they just kept telling him, soon, Mike, hold on. It's going to be okay. Meanwhile, the owner of the shop at this point had called Mike's dad to tell him what was going on. And so as all these people are waiting for this doctor to show up to cut Mike's leg off, Mike's father shows up and basically barrels through the crowd and starts screaming, "I'll get my son out of here." But as soon as he saw his son, he was totally taken aback. Mike was up to his chin in water. There was a diver behind him in the water with him, holding him up, barely keeping his head above the water. Mike's face was totally pale and his eyes were totally unfocused. And he had this weird blank expression like he wasn't even there. And then a second later, a whole wall of police came running up to Mike's dad to stop him from getting any closer. And they told Mike's father they were doing everything they could to try to get his son out. And for now, they told him he just needed to go home. And so even though Mike's dad did not want to abandon his son, he could tell with all these police standing there in front of him, there was no way he was going to be able to go up there with his son. and so he would turn around and head back home without even speaking to his son. Then, when Mike's dad got home, he turned on the news, and the news was showing live coverage of his son trapped in that grate. And just a couple of minutes later, Mike's dad would watch his son die on the news. By the time that doctor arrived with that special saw to cut off Mike's leg, it was already too late. Mike had passed away from hypothermia. Our next story is called Fans. In 2009, 25-year-old Larry Mario Moncada graduated from college and moved back in with his parents in Iowa. He was excited about his future, and his parents were extremely proud of him. As soon as Larry moved back home, the first thing he did was go out and get a placeholder job at the No Frills supermarket, which was a local supermarket right in town. He figured, you know what, it's temporary, but I don't want to just sit around all day. I want to do that until I find my career. But even though the job was supposed to be temporary, he found that he kind of loved the job because he loved the people he worked with, and his coworkers would later say that they loved working with him too. But everything in Larry and his family's life would get turned completely upside down in November of 2009. On November 26th, while a blizzard raged outside, Larry and his family celebrated Thanksgiving inside. After everyone was done eating, Larry told them that he actually had an overnight shift at the supermarket. And I don't think his family knew he had this shift, so they were like, oh man, do you really gotta go? The weather's so bad. And he's like, no, I gotta go, I don't mind. And they're like, all right, well, hey, sorry you gotta work. And Larry walks outside and goes to work. The next morning when he came back from that shift, his mother would say something seemed off about him. When he came inside, he was very disoriented. He didn't really know where he was. And his mom's trying to tell him that everything's okay. What's going on? Did something happen out there? And this is when it dawned on her that he could be having an anxiety attack. Just a few years earlier, Larry had had a whole bunch of panic attacks and he was really struggling with anxiety. And it wasn't until his mom made him go to the doctor and put him on medication that he stabilized. But at this moment, she didn't know if her son was on any medication or not, so just to play it safe, she said, hey, let's go to the doctor and have you looked at. You don't seem well. So she brings him to the doctor, and the doctor quickly prescribes Larry an antidepressant. They go and fill the prescription, they go back home, and Larry takes one of these antidepressants. But the medication didn't seem to be doing anything because over the course of the day, Larry got progressively more and more stressed out and more confused seeming, and eventually he told his mom that he was hearing voices in his head that were telling him his heart is beating too quickly and he needs to eat sugar to slow down his heart. And his mom is looking at him thinking, what do I do about this? And so all she could think to do was just to stand next to him and kind of comfort him as he sits there eating sugar over the course of the day. Finally that night he would fall asleep, and his mother prayed that over the course of the night that somehow this medication he had been prescribed would kick in and he would wake up and feel better, because so far it really seemed to only be getting exponentially worse. But the next morning when Larry got up, he was just as bad as the night before, except now he was having these vivid hallucinations. He said there were people in the house that were looking for him, and so he spent the day running around the house hiding from people in the house that were not actually there. Then finally that night, Larry just kind of loses it and begins screaming at his parents and berating them before suddenly running out the front door without shoes, without a jacket, no wallet, no cell phone, no anything. And he just runs directly into the blizzard and disappears. His family was so caught off guard by this happening that it took them a minute to get out the front door after him, but it was snowing so hard they could barely see in front of their face, and they knew he was gone. So immediately they call the police, but the police have the same issue. They can't really go looking for him right now because the visibility was so bad. And so they told his family that we can't really start until tomorrow morning, so hopefully he turns up tonight. So the next day when the weather clears up a little bit, the police go out looking for Larry, and they're asking people in town if they've seen him, and no one's seen Larry. And unfortunately, because it had snowed so much the night before, any of Larry's tracks leading out of Larry's house were now covered over. And so after a couple of days of this, when there's just no sign of this guy, the police say to the family, look, there's not much we can do. We're just going to have to wait to see if he turns up. 10 years later, the No Frills supermarket where Larry used to work was out of business and it was about to get torn down, and some contractors were sent in to start ripping down the shelving and breaking down the inside of the building. And when they went into the back and began pulling away those huge freezers that keep your milk and your dairy products in, they start pulling those away from the wall. Larry's body comes tumbling out. It had been pinned in this tiny 18-inch wide space between the back of the freezer and the wall. It's believed on the night Larry ran out of his parents' house barefoot into a blizzard, he ran right up the road and went to the No Frills supermarket. Now, it was closed at the time, but he had access to the back door with the key code because he worked there. And so he went inside and he climbed on top of the freezers, the section of the freezers that jut back into the space that no one in the store can see. And he climbed on top because on top of there, all the workers would kind of congregate up there. It was like a little clubhouse where the workers would avoid the managers for little pockets of the day. And so Larry probably climbed up there because it represented a really happy place for him. And when he got up there, he must have somehow tripped and fallen into the tiny 18-inch space between the freezer and the wall. Investigators believe there's no way he actually got hurt when he fell into this little space. He got wedged in there, but he wasn't harmed. The problem was these huge fans that run constantly to keep the freezer cold were unbelievably loud and would have completely drowned out his cries for help. And so no one knows for sure how long this took, but eventually he would die because no one heard him. Looking back at old Facebook posts around the time that Larry would have been dead behind the freezer, there was a whole bunch of people that were commenting on Facebook that they didn't want to shop at the No Frills supermarket anymore. Apparently there was a really bad smell coming out of the back freezer. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Blue Door. On the morning of September 19th, 2013, a man named Mark Casey sat with his girlfriend, Lynn Spalding, in the triage area of the emergency room at San Francisco General Hospital. A nurse took Lynn's temperature and her blood pressure, while Mark tried to explain what had been going on with Lynn over the past few weeks. Lynn, who was now 57, had been dealing with this really intense stomach pain, and so she had gone to the doctor, and she had been diagnosed with a urinary tract infection, and she was given antibiotics for it, but despite taking those antibiotics, it didn't get rid of the stomach pain. And in fact, her stomach pain was only getting worse, she was losing weight, and she just seemed really frail. But despite her condition obviously getting worse every single day, over the past few weeks, Lynn had basically refused to go back to the hospital, despite Mark saying, "We really gotta go, you're getting worse, we gotta have you looked at." But she just kept saying no. And then finally, when Mark noticed Lynn was now becoming somewhat despondent, like he would try to talk to her and her eyes would glaze over and she would look off into the distance like she didn't even hear him, Mark had just looked at Lynn and said, "You know what? I'm taking you to the hospital." And so he put her in the car, he brought her to the hospital, and now that he was here, he had to explain what was going on because Lynn was still despondent, just kind of staring off into space and very likely having no idea what was going on. And so after Mark gave all the information to the nurse said that, okay, Lynn needs to be admitted to the hospital. And so after a short wait, an orderly came over and pushed Lynn's wheelchair up to the 5th floor where she'd be staying, and Mark went with them. And then once in the room, Mark helped Lynn get settled in her bed. And again, Lynn is just kind of staring off into space, not really paying attention. And then a whole team of nurses and doctors came in and hooked Lynn up to IVs and different machines to make sure they could monitor her. And then at some point, one of the doctors pulled Mark aside and said, we think Lynn is dealing with some kind of infection. And so what we need to do is run some tests to figure out what this infection is. And then hopefully we can treat it. And so Mark said, okay, that sounds great. And then all day, Mark sat right next to Lynn and held her hand as the medical team came in and out of the room running all these tests. The following day, the medical team still didn't know what was wrong with Lynn. The tests they had run so far were inconclusive or were negative. Now, the biggest issue with Lynn was not trying to figure out what infection she had or how to cure her. Instead, it was, how do we keep Lynn in her hospital room? Because on this second day that Lynn was at the hospital, despite being very despondent still, any chance she got, she was getting out of her bed and trying to escape her room. And so the medical team, they kept having to go find her and bring her back to her room. And they tried to explain to her, like, Lynn, you're sick. That's why you're here. You need to stay in your room. But Lynn clearly was just not getting it. She was just not there. And she would just say to the team, I want to go home. I just want to go home. I want to go home. And they would say, well, Lynn, you got to get better first, and then you can go home. Now, Mark, like the medical staff, was also concerned about Lynn's behavior. It was not safe for her to get up and flee her hospital room. But Mark kind of secretly thought, maybe this is a good sign, because the day before, Lynn couldn't even walk on her own. And now today, she's walking around on her own trying to escape the hospital, which is bad. But, she's ambulatory. That's got to be a good sign. And also, Mark was thinking that because Lynn was fleeing her room over and over again, she's going to get even better medical care because the staff has to be super focused on her. And so Mark was feeling kind of optimistic that Lynn was on the road to recovery. The next morning, so now Lynn has been at the hospital for 2 days at this point, a nurse went into Lynn's room to check on her at about 10:15 a.m., and she walked up to Lynn, who was in her bed, and Lynn immediately told the nurse that she wanted to go home. And the nurse said, sorry, Lynn, we still don't know what's wrong with you. You got to stay here for now. But again, it was pretty clear Lynn did not understand what the nurse was saying. And so Lynn was not agitated. She was laying in bed and did not appear to, want to flee the room anytime soon. And so the nurse took Lynn's vitals. They were all basically normal. And then the nurse wrote down on Lynn's chart that her condition as of this moment was fair. And then the nurse left the room. And once this nurse was gone, Lynn laid in bed for a second, and then when nobody else came in the room, she sat up, she hopped off the bed, and she took off her hospital gown. She pulled out all the cords and wires that were on her. Then she put on her jeans, her boots, her jacket. She grabbed her purse off the table, and she walked out the door. And the second she walked out the door, she would have been in this long hallway, except her room was at the end of the hallway. So when she stepped out into that hallway, if she turned right, she would have seen a long, long stretch of hallway with other hospital rooms and lots of staff and doctors and nurses kind of walking around. But to her left, it would have been a dead end with a single blue door with a green exit sign over the top of it. And so Lynn, she steps into the hallway, she looks down the long side to the right, then she looks to the left, she sees the blue door, and she goes to the blue door, she opens it up, and she disappears inside. When the nurse came back to Lynn's room and saw she wasn't there, she reported Lynn missing. Now, remember, the hospital was well aware of the fact that Lynn had been trying to escape for the past 48 hours, and so nobody was really shocked by this. In fact, the hospital, their first move was to contact Mark, who had actually gone home the night before to get some real sleep and to take a shower. And so they contacted Mark and they said, hey, Lynn's not here. Is she with you? And Mark was like, no, I'm home. She's not here. I have not seen her. I haven't talked to her. I have no idea where she is. And so the hospital at this point began this huge search in their building, just checking the entire property for Lynn, but there was no trace of her. And so the police were contacted and they launched a search both of the hospital grounds and also of the surrounding areas. And they too could not find a trace of Lynn. It was like Lynn just vanished into thin air. That is, until October 8th, 2013, so 17 days after Lynn had strolled through that blue exit door. On that day, October 8th, a hospital maintenance worker was walking down the long hallway in the hospital, not on the 5th floor where Lynn was staying, but one floor below, so on the 4th floor. He's walking down this long hallway in the direction of the dead end side, so the same side that Lynn was on where her room was, but again, one floor above. And the maintenance worker, he walks all the way to the end of this hallway on the 4th floor, and he arrives in front of the blue door with the green exit sign above it. Again, this is below where Lynn was, but it looks the same. And the maintenance worker, he opened up the door, and when he looked out of the 4th floor door, he just froze, because what he was looking at just seemed impossible. And then he had this urge to scream, but he knew there were all these patients and kids and doctors and stuff in the hallway behind him, and he didn't want to scare anyone. And so very quietly, he reached down and grabbed his radio, and he called for help. In order to explain what happened next, you have to have a basic understanding of the layout of this building, specifically the outside of it. If you were outside looking at this building, you would see an enclosed staircase that runs from the bottom to the top of the building, with outdoor landings on each floor. The one on top is the 5th floor landing, and the one below it, with a single person on it, is the 4th floor landing. And to get onto these outdoor landings, you have to walk through those blue exit doors at the end of those hallways. These blue doors are emergency exits, and so when you go out these blue doors, once they shut, they lock automatically. But now you're out on this outdoor landing, and immediately to your right, although you can't see it in this picture, there is actually another door that leads to this enclosed stairwell that will bring you all the way to the ground floor, where there's another door that's unlocked that will bring you out to safety. And so again, you walk out one of those blue doors, you're on this landing, you can turn, open up another door, you're in the stairwell, and you can evacuate. So, in theory, if you were a person that really wanted to escape this hospital, like Lynn did, going out one of these blue door emergency exits was a great idea. It would bring you to the ground. This is a way to escape the hospital. But remember, Lynn was totally confused. Mentally, she was just not there because of whatever illness was affecting her. And so when she walked out that door, she arrived on the 5th floor landing, and the door shut behind her and it locked. And the theory is, as soon as Lynn got out there, maybe she had some second thoughts and wanted to go back into the hospital. And so she turned and she grabbed that door and tried to open it back up again, but because it locks automatically, it wouldn't open. And so Lynn did have the wherewithal to turn and see this other door that led to this enclosed stairwell, the emergency stairwell that did go to the ground floor. She could absolutely go all the way down and escape. She could do that. She went down one floor to the 4th floor landing. And when she got there, she left the stairwell and she went to that door that would lead back into the hospital on the 4th floor, and she tried it, but of course it was locked. And then again, instead of her just going back into the stairwell and going down and escaping to safety, she, for some reason, just stayed on the 4th floor landing. Again, you gotta remember that she's not all there mentally, and so she was confused, and she just stayed there on the landing, basically waiting to be rescued. But despite these huge searches of the hospital property by hospital staff and by the police, for some reason, this area, this landing on the 4th floor, was never checked. And so nobody found her. That is until October 4th. So at this point, Lynn has been outside for 13 days on this landing, and a researcher from the hospital, for whatever reason, exited out one of these emergency doors, and they began making their way downstairs. And when they passed by the 4th floor landing, they spotted Lynn on the ground on the 4th floor landing. But instead of going over to her and seeing if she was okay, this researcher just called security and said, "Hey, there's a patient outside on the 4th floor landing, like, come check it out." And then instead of waiting for security, the researcher just left, leaving Lynn alone, and security at the hospital, who said they were going to go check, they didn't. And so 4 more days would go by with still nobody officially finding Lynn, and then finally on October 8th, the hospital maintenance worker opened up the blue door on the 4th floor, and he saw the 4th floor landing, that exterior landing, and he saw Lynn, and he knew she was dead. Officials were never able to determine when Lynn died, so it's not clear how long she was alive out on that landing. But it is possible she could have been alive when that researcher found her, but obviously help didn't come in time. Ultimately, Lynn's family would sue the city and the hospital, and they would be awarded $3 million.